I'm dual-hatted today. I'm Todd Lindberg, and my first hat is to welcome you to the Hoover Institution's Johnson Center, our office here in Washington, which was established in this particular location about 2.5 years ago, and which has devoted to the proposition that we can all benefit from more higher-level discussion and help bring some of Hoover at Stanford to Washington. And so welcome all. And now I will turn it over to Naomi Kikoler of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Thank you very much, Todd. Can everyone hear me? Sure. Great. I want to start by thanking the Hoover Institution for hosting today's discussion along with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's an incredibly timely conversation. The UN Secretary General Guterres at the Munich Security Forum started his discussion by saying that we live in a dangerous world. I thought that was an incredibly somber way to start a conversation, but perhaps very apt, and I think it informs the conversation that we're having today. It's a real honor to be here with Ambassador Lee Feinstein and Todd, who have been not just a champion of these issues around atrocity prevention, but of many of the related norms and institutions that many of us hold very dear, including the ICC and the UN. This conversation today probably looks very different than what we might have thought the conversation would look like over 2 years ago when this project was launched. As many of you know, every administration here in the United States since George Bush Sr. has had to wrestle with the very real possibility and also the commission of genocide and crimes against humanity during their particular tenure, as have had governments around the world. And in light of that, there has been an increased focus over the last 20 and 30 years on atrocity prevention, culminating in the most recent administration's emphasis on identifying and clearly articulating that atrocity prevention was a core national security interest of the United States. And in saying that, the emphasis was not just on responding to the Iraqs and Syrias, to the situations where violence has already unfolded and bodies have started piling up, but very much towards trying to ensure that there could be a systematic process put in place, institutional effort created, tools strengthened to try to respond to the early warning signs of mass atrocities, to try to mitigate those risks, and ideally to avert the commission of atrocities from even occurring, while at the same time ensuring that capacities were developed to be able to halt atrocities once they start. This project was undertaken very much with a recognition that the U.S. cannot go it alone on these particular efforts, that there needs to be cooperation amongst like-minded states that have shared values, that have the capacity to respond, and ideally the political will to be able to. And a pragmatic consideration on our part was that really those states are the transatlantic states, and that more cooperation both on prevention and protection would lead us to a situation where hopefully we would not find ourselves saying in the aftermath of yet again another genocide or large-scale crimes against humanity, saying never again, and that we'd failed to heed the lessons of the Holocaust. So this project was undertaken very much to try to identify the gaps and the existing capacities that already exist within the transatlantic region and chart a path forward for how governments could work more closely together, with a recognition that at the time there was a more unified understanding of the importance of atrocity prevention. And I think that perhaps that's a good place to start, with Todd giving us a little bit of an overview of the key findings of the report and the case to be made for prioritizing atrocity prevention.
Well, thanks very much, Naomi. Thanks to the museum for sponsoring this project, and also our thanks to the Stanley Foundation for being a participating partner. We also partnered with several other international, global think tanks and who were very helpful in enabling us to complete this work. I want to begin really with what I hope is an uncontroversial remark. And we'll get to the more controversial remark shortly. But when we started this project, it was just as Russia was becoming more restive and becoming a little bit more adventuresome. So there was a lot of interest in NATO about the return to the basic mission of defense. And of course, there's rising China. There's fallout from financial crises, et cetera. And we were a little bit worried that the broad issue of prevention, of of atrocity prevention, conflict prevention, et cetera, was dropping in salience, that it might become somehow a second-tier consideration with regard to security. And as we moved on in our work, what we discovered was that we had come to reject that conclusion in its entirety. And the reason for that is that prevention issues, atrocity prevention, can often be the only way to avert first-tier security issues, which is to say, when you have an atrocity situation that is gathering and you do not respond to it, what you can end up with is, frankly, Syria, which began with atrocities and was understood at the time to have begun with atrocities. I would say that there are more or less two elephants in the room with regard to the issue of atrocity prevention. One of them is Syria, which I think is an indication of what can happen with a failure to take effective international action in order to mitigate the crisis there. And of course, the second would have to be Libya. Libya having been conceived and executed at the United Nations and at NATO and elsewhere as a fulfillment of the responsibility to protect, at least initially, did seem to move a bit beyond that in terms of the destabilization, the removal of the Gaddafi regime, and then, of course, the difficulties in the post-Gaddafi period of managing to set up a government that could effectively manage security, et cetera, for Libyans. So if we have, on the one hand, a kind of exercise in Libya that was undertaken in the name of atrocity prevention, and that succeeded insofar as it probably, I think, did halt a massacre, prevent a massacre from taking place in Libya. Nevertheless, we see that an inability or an unwillingness to be effective in terms of the aftermath of such an intervention leaves us in a very difficult place, and one that no one would like to be in. Syria, on the other hand, shows, I think, a product of inaction, of an unwillingness to intervene, to take action that might mitigate, halt what Assad was doing. And we see the result there. I think the worst global crisis that we confront as an international community in generations, a crisis that is ongoing, shows no signs of abating, that will cost billions and billions, scores of billions of dollars in order to try to mitigate its effects over the next decades, and in which the long-term future, the long-term outlook remains bleak. So I think if we frame our issue properly, if we understand that atrocities are not a boutique consideration, but rather central to the maintenance of international peace and stability and security, then it becomes quite clear that the prevention of atrocities is a first-tier security issue. Now, the focus of our report is on transatlantic cooperation, and there's a reason for that. It is that among these states in the Transatlantic Alliance, we could construe this actually somewhat more broadly than that, but you have like-minded states and you have capable states. You have states that in general are interested in these issues and see the potential dangers of ignoring these issues, and that have some resources to bring to bear on the problems at hand. And so we thought, after considerable consideration of how to frame this project, that this was the place to begin, for the simple reason that if we are unable or unwilling to get this group effectively organized to address this issue, exactly how we would move beyond it would be a very difficult question to answer. So that was, I think, the principal part of our thought with regard to that. Now, obviously, this is not a Western imperialist proposal or agenda. This is about keeping people alive, and we have partners all around the world who are like-minded in that regard, and for that matter, there is no shortage of malefactors who think that that they can advance their own positions by perpetrating these kinds of atrocities and atrocity crimes. Obviously, we need to be in constant conversations, diplomatically and otherwise, with people outside of the transatlantic space. But our thought was certainly that the transatlantic space is the place to begin to deepen and broaden international cooperation, collective efforts. What we say, President Obama having declared that in addition to being a core moral responsibility of the United States, a core national security interest of the United States, that we and our allies should acknowledge that this is a core collective security interest that we share. And we need to, we have a lot of work to do in terms of getting all the, developing that level of cooperation that we think we need. So I would just give you a quick tick-tock of our principal findings, and then turn over to Lee to talk a little bit about our recommendations. We do find that the principle of responsibility to protect is at a crossroads. The Libya experience has been a challenge to the effective use of R2P. However, it's also naive to think that R2P has gone away. It's still quite important in UN. There's been some 30 resolutions since Libya that have referenced the responsibility to protect. It's hardly a dead letter, but at the same time, neither is it what some had hoped, maybe, which would be the automatic driver of a prevention policy. It remains a tool, an important tool. If we didn't have it, we would want it, but there's no substitute for the ability to generate the political will necessary to deal with particular crises. Second of our international findings was that UN peacekeeping is central to the effort to deter, stop, and prevent mass atrocities. The UN has been effective. There have been problems. There remain problems related to resources, et cetera, but President Obama was indeed correct to convene his peacekeeping summit, and I think that the importance of that effort in real-world terms in actually keeping people alive is undeniable at this point. The third international finding is that atrocity prevention takes place under a variety of labels, and these include conflict prevention, stabilization, development, human rights, and on and on. And I think that we have to acknowledge that there will be no standardized approach to this subject. What that means is that we would embrace the pluralism that is out there in terms of thinking about how to deal with these kinds of issues. And in addition, we need to get people representing these various perspectives talking to each other, not for the purpose of converting someone from one perspective to another, but for the broader purpose of illuminating what their particular perspective contributes to this issue and what other perspectives may be missing. So this is an important principle. We're not going to reinvent the wheel or start at square one on this issue. Governments, international organizations already are looking at these issues through certain lenses, and rather than try to universalize one particular perspective on it, we need to get them talking to each other. Our fourth international finding was that the legal basis for intervention to halt atrocities remains keenly disputed, and this is an important point that we will need to pursue greater clarity on as we go ahead. And finally, on our international findings, that civil society can indeed play an important role in prevention, especially in terms of on-the-ground reportage, but also in terms of the advocacy that civil society groups can and have engaged in sort of energizing, activating government and other international action. Just two more words on U.S. findings. Of course, the Obama administration established its Atrocities Prevention Board. And we have found that the APB is indeed establishing patterns of cooperation among disparate U.S. agencies. This is not a small achievement. The idea of having a coordinated interagency process looking at long-term threats is novel. The fact that now U.S. agencies across the government are being briefed by the intelligence community on its assessment of particular situations, it can only improve policymaking going forward. And in addition, second finding is that indeed government agencies in the United States have begun to take atrocity prevention more seriously. It is becoming a more common perspective. It's hardly universalized in general now, but one of the elements that was important going back to the days of the Genocide Prevention Task Force of the Holocaust Museum and USIP and the American Academy of Diplomacy, which I had the pleasure of serving on the senior staff. With the importance of mainstreaming these kinds of concerns about lives, about atrocity into the policy discussion in specific agencies was a high priority, and so we are seeing some progress with regard to that. Although again, a lot more to do. Let me just add that atrocity prevention, as Naomi began with, is not an Obama administration pet rock or something that began with the Obama administration. The record here goes back actually to, in certain respects, to the persistent problem of failure to prevent atrocities. The modern demarcation point is usually taken to be Rwanda, insofar as that was post-Cold War. But of course, Yugoslavia and beyond, and Darfur, all these areas have been instances in which government policymakers have felt themselves to be frustrated and unable to come up with effective responses. And it is that to which I think we must address ourselves. And what we come not at the beginning of the process, but a few steps into it, and we come at an interesting time for this broader question. I think the importance of understanding this as a security issue is high and rising in the current political environment. And I think that although we've done a decent beginning, we just have an awful lot more work to do. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the museum for all of its tremendous work on genocide prevention and on the recognition that the core work of the museum and the best way to honor the victims of the Holocaust is to do work that leads to saving lives now and in the future. It's an important innovation, and the museum's the best place to be doing this kind of work. So, congratulations to you, and thank you for your support of us and for the Stanley Foundation support as well. I'd just elaborate a little bit on what Todd said. And first, just to tell you, I think a lot of you already know us. We know a lot of you. But Todd and I have been at this together for several years, including in a congressionally mandated report on U.S. and UN relations coming out of a related failure, which was the perception of failure, and I think the accurate perception of failure in Darfur, which people put at the doorstep of the UN in a correct and overly simplistic way. And so that report, which focused on UN reform, led to a recommendation, and it was a Republican and Democratic report. The co-chairs were Senator George Mitchell and former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, so a pretty wide range of diversity there. And they reached the conclusion that really the centerpiece of what the UN ought to be doing is the responsibility to protect. And that helped to create a framework in which there was acceptance or at least acquiescence in the United States and more broadly in the international community around the concept of responsibility to protect. So to Todd's point that genocide prevention isn't a pet rock of the Obama administration, really the first instance in which the United States had formally endorsed the responsibility to protect as a component of this was under Bush 43. And that's important, and Todd and I we agree on most things, but we're also come from different political parties. So it's significant, and you can probably figure out who's who. But I think this is important because we proceed on the basis of these issues in a nonpartisan way, and that's, I think, really essential to what we do. On the question of second tier, what I wanted to just add was how important this was to our work, because when it was when we were beginning our project, suddenly all of these, first-tier security order issues, or what are traditionally seen to be, were really bubbling up. And so there was Russian aggression in Ukraine. There were a range of other issues having to do with Iran that were preoccupying the U.S. government and others at the time. And so it was the kind of the post-Libya period, as Todd was saying. So the kind of the appetite for re-engaging in what was perceived to be or described as humanitarian intervention was really less salient. And so in pitching our report and figuring out how to frame it, and we tried to come from this from a foreign policy perspective rather than purely from the perspective of atrocity prevention, we were trying to find out what the opening would be, how to talk to a broader community who wasn't already predisposed to trying to address these issues. And our first lob at that was to say, well, yes, there are these first-tier security issues, but don't forget about this other stuff. And we rapidly realized that this was the wrong approach to take. And in fact, our advisory board, which was deliberately comprised of people from across the Atlantic, but not necessarily people who were steeped in the atrocity prevention business, they came back to us and said, well, what are you doing? Because, and of course, Syria was then on people's minds. And so the point here was that the events in Syria have created, a series of spiraling events that are very much at the heart of the security issues that we're facing as a nation and globally, and have created not only the greatest refugee crisis since World War II, but they've roiled international politics, and I would dare say domestic politics as well. So this is kind of an indication of how an issue which is seen as kind of on the margins of foreign policy, in fact, is very much at the forefront. So it's not. So the issue isn't: is it a first tier? Is it a second tier? Foreign policy makers will make the judgment about how to prioritize. This is not a second tier issue per se. It is, again, as President Obama said, a core national security interest as well as a moral one. So the second point I wanted to make in the findings category, and I'll get to some of our recommendations, is just the degree to which, I guess the word of the day is global disarray. Some people have used the words the great unraveling, but the degree to which the flouting of profound international norms contributes to the fraying of the international system. And this is, I think, a non-trivial point and one that's underappreciated. Mm-hmm. Not only is the flouting of fundamental international norms something that is taking place without any global consequences or foreign policy consequences. In some cases, it's being rewarded, and it's being indicated as an example of a country getting its mojo back. So that, I think, is an important point. And then, of course, added to our report, which was written prior to the election results in the United States, of course, is the role of the United States. Mm-hmm. So central to what we've been saying in our report is, whatever the weaknesses of the U.S. approach have been, there have been at least in terms of our governmental organization, some important innovations and also some important actions. We are recommending that these be broadened to include the transatlantic community. But there's also, it just needs to be said, obviously, the case about what the role of the United States is going to be. I have a feeling that Naomi is going to ask us a question about that later on, and we can talk about it. But let me just touch on a few of our recommendations, one of which I just was talking about, which was to try to broaden beyond the United States this idea that atrocity prevention and taking steps to stop mass killings when they do take place ought to be seen and adopted across the Atlantic as a core national security interest, as a collective national security interest for the transatlantic community. We also talked about peacekeeping. Todd did. We make a number of recommendations on the reform of peacekeeping. This is an old story. There have been talks about deeper involvement of some of the major militarily capable powers who have, for the better part of the last generation, opted out of peacekeeping operations to get more directly involved in them, both as participants, but also, more importantly, more deeply involved in some of the training activities. We looked at the issue of how financial sanctions in the United States have been used as an effective foreign policy tool, and more intensively over the course of the second term of the Obama administration, both in a range of foreign policy circumstances like non-proliferation, for example, in the case of Iran and the successful efforts to negotiate a nuclear agreement with Iran, but also in the case of atrocity preventions as well. We also saw, by the way, an instance in which sanctions and agreement on using sanctions as an important tool of diplomacy was broadened to be to include first the transatlantic community in the case of Iran, but through the United Nations, actually all of the permanent members of the Security Council. That was a significant broadening of the use of sanctions. And we saw this as well in Russia and in dealing with the annexation of Crimea and Russian aggression in Ukraine. So some of the inherent difficulties in enacting a sanctions policy that was transatlantic were overcome in specific but important circumstances in the transatlantic community. And we applauded in this report some of the steps that our Department of Treasury, right over there, had taken on the mass atrocity question. We get into details about what some of those are, but we also thought that this was a very important opportunity to broaden that kind of cooperation with our transatlantic partners and others. And the last recommendation I would focus on, and there are others in the report, is still the paucity of agreed international law or legal thinking on the question of when and under what circumstances to take action in cases of the threat of mass killings or the actual commission of mass killings. This is an old story, but there's been very little. Progress back to the days of legitimate but illegal, which was and remains the mainstream view of the effort to use force to prevent atrocities in the absence of a Security Council vote. And we've been very pleased in looking at a preview of this report that the ABA has adopted our recommendation to look further into coming up across the Atlantic on some rules of the road, if not some further advances in international law to clarify this issue. There's been some interesting practice that's developed, habits that have developed through the variety of circumstances in which this issue has arose, which we believe create the possibility for getting us out of the habit of having process interfere with the ability, particularly in exigent circumstances, to take action that's deemed to be consistent with international law. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to pick up on two themes that you've both talked about. One is the prioritization of atrocity prevention as a national security interest, and whether or not that actually is something that, it's hard to say, we don't know where this administration is going, but I think it is a fair question to be asked of our European partners as well, the degree to which that remains a trend that we saw emerging. And I think the second question is, in the report and in the work that we did, we went to a number of the capitals that are discussed in this particular report, from Berlin to London to Ottawa to Brussels, to meet with government officials, to meet with NATO officials, UN officials in the preparation of this particular report. And I think one of your kind of strongest findings was that the U.S. under the Obama administration was really leagues ahead of its partners on the institutionalization of atrocity prevention, the development of clear processes and also refinement of tools that could be used, especially in a preventive stage, to try to help de-escalate a situation and avert situations from getting worse. And that there was, yes, shared values, different language that was being discussed, some commonality and cooperation, but a lot of that remained very ad hoc with your transatlantic partners. And that the U.S. was very much driving, it was uniquely placed to play a leadership role in encouraging greater institutionalization of those efforts. And I'm curious whether or not you feel that that transatlantic effort can really survive in the absence, and it perhaps is too early to say whether or not that's going to be the case, but in the absence of clear U.S. leadership pushing for multilateral engagement, bilateral engagement on atrocity prevention. I'll start with some easy ones.
Nodding at me.
I'm nodding at you.
Well, look, there are many people in this room who have had who had personal experience developing these measures and making them work inside the U.S. government. So I speak with tremendous modesty about all of that. I'm not the first person to say that calling the Atrocities Prevention Board set up expectations that were unrealistic for, or grandiose for, what some kind of an interagency process could do. But if you think about it in terms of how the U.S. government works, it has accomplished its aims. So, you know, the issues of highest policy level priority are never going to be decided by an ad hoc group that focuses on an individual issue. It's just not, it's just never the way it works. But what a group like that can do, and I think to a significant extent did do, was institutionalize a process by which issues that might not otherwise rise to the policy issue were being addressed on a regular basis as part of a mandate that came from the White House. And that is very significant. And it included a number of players who previously didn't really consider this part of their mandate. I mean, starting with, and they had been involved in this before, but starting with the intelligence community, which in preparation for these monthly meetings would be tasked with the requirement to prepare reports on what was happening where and to brief them to this interagency group. The Treasury Department is another organization which had not previously thought of itself as playing a critical role in this area, and as a consequence of this, it did. And even USAID, which really, and there are people in this room who we have to thank for this, which was at the center of these activities. I mean, it was not that long ago that the development agencies of the United States were not enthusiastic, and in fact saw this kind of a mission as antithetical to the apolitical activities in which they should engage. And that changed very, very dramatically. What we saw when we would go overseas was, and this is why, not to pat ourselves on the back, but what we saw was some of the same problems that we had confronted in trying to develop this process were still in evidence there, particularly in dealing with the aid and development agencies. And of course, the EU is one of the preeminent providers of global assistance, but sometimes they attended our meetings, but usually they did, but usually not in the company of people who did foreign policy. So we saw that, we would end up having separate meetings because of some of the difficulty there. So, on the broader question, Naomi, it's very hard to answer. I am unapologetically of the view that American leadership really matters and that it is difficult to get things done in the absence of American leadership, whatever the issue is. But Europe is dealing with these issues very much and very directly in its own backyard, and it has led the way in the response to the Syrian atrocities. And so there is leadership there. But one of the paradoxes of all of this is that the forces of openness and global cooperation are themselves being challenged by the very forces that have been unleashed by the crisis in Syria.
The only thing I think I need to add to that is the Atrocities Prevention Board is not a model for other countries. The United States has vastly more governmental resources, and we don't need many APBs in other countries, but we do need to meet regularly with our allies and focus on this issue. And I think that that is always easier when the United States is willing to take a leadership role. However, I also think that there is a corrective mechanism in international politics, or at least there has been for a while. And the corrective mechanism is that in the absence of leadership, effective leadership from wherever, things tend to get worse rapidly. And I think you'll recall the statement attributed to George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, James Baker. I don't know if he's ever confirmed that he said it, but of Yugoslavia as it was breaking up, we don't have a dog in that fight. Then we'll let the Europeans handle it. It's in their backyard. And there's some European efforts to deal with the situation there, but they weren't effective. And so then you're faced with, well, do you allow a situation to deteriorate, or does the United States get more or less activated? If not as a kind of a doctrinal principle of unilateral action, then as a kind of default, a reset response to failure. So I'm hopeful that the understanding of the problems that we face will continue. Will produce an impulse within the United States government and also within our allies' governments to work on these problems, to take effective action.
Do we risk? I'm struck by the reference to U.S. aid and the meetings that you had in Europe, because one of the things that I'm concerned about is the U.S. has played a catalytic role in convening a small group of like-minded states around atrocity prevention, and not necessarily trying to recreate the APB, but encouraging there to be a slightly more rigorous and defined area of work and earlier engagement. And USAID has actually been really central to trying to identify opportunities for these countries that perhaps are major funders and have a presence in certain countries and can do some of the upstream work, even in a time of economic austerity and reduction in kind of investments there. But that presupposes that those governments see a value in engaging in an upstream way in the Guineas and the Burundis. And I think the U.S. was very much trying to encourage that type of an orientation in addition to the crisis response, because inevitably any government's always going to have something to say when the Security Council is dealing with a burning crisis or a crisis in a kind of a nearby region. But that focus on upstream prevention that I think really has increasingly emerged over the last 8 years, how do we continue to kind of foster greater transatlantic momentum? Is it through bilateral relations? Is it investment in the UN and NATO? Many of the countries would talk about their investments as being through the UN on these types of particular initiatives. And what does that mean for U.S. policy?
Yeah, I think in the period that is ahead of us, the critical question is going to be efficacy. And it has two elements. There is efficacy of process, and there is efficacy of outcome. I don't think the United States at the present moment is especially interested in measuring achievement on the basis of inputs, dollars spent. The question will be, what did those dollars buy? And the question won't necessarily be framed as what would be the optimal ideal process for thinking about this set of issues. The question will be what works in thinking about these kinds of issues. And I think that's a reasonable focus. We're in certain respects, as Lee noted, the liberal international order is under considerable stress at the moment. And I think it never hurts to revert to these basic kind of consequentialist questions of what works, and I'm not afraid of that set of questions either. I don't think anybody should be, but at the same time, it doesn't go without saying that we already have answers to these questions. If I'm counting beans in the United States government, I think I'm going to want some demonstration that what we're doing is effective in the two ways that I have described. Effective in terms of identifying problems and directing resources toward their solution or amelioration, and then also the ability to demonstrate that what you've done has paid a dividend, has actually made you better. Now, of course, prevention is notoriously difficult to prove. It's, in fact, a bit of an epistemological black hole. I think that taking military action, NATO taking military action in Kosovo, over Kosovo, prevented a genocide, and I think that view is fairly widely shared, or if not a genocide, at least slaughter on a mass scale. But it's not a provable, quantifiable proposition. It remains a counterfactual, and so that's a problem. But I think that there are ways of looking at these things with regard to testing for efficacy, and I would urge everybody who's interested in this subject to think about those kinds of tests and how to demonstrate that we are effective when we take up these kinds of challenges.
Well, I was just in Europe being asked, and I was asked this question about U.S. leadership more broadly, and the question was particularly about the current administration and how Europeans ought to be thinking about what the United States would do. And my response was to quote Senator McCain, which is don't count the United States out. And a German colleague of mine who's based in the United States, his answer was, be afraid, be very afraid. So that's but I actually do think at the end of the day that the valuation of interests will prevail, and that I do think that the United States somehow or other, maybe not as soon as we would like, and it may take longer than we would like, will not shirk its responsibilities in these areas.
I think we're going to open it up to questions.
Rachel Oswald, reporter with Congressional Quarterly. Can you think of anybody in the Trump administration who you see as more receptive to these ideas, maybe going below the cabinet level. I recognize that there are not many senior officials in place below that. And in the absence of anybody, can you think of any congressional leaders who are going to be more important than during the Obama administration in terms of highlighting these issues and making sure that funding is attached and authorizations are attached?
You're quite right that that it's difficult to talk about this issue at the sub-cabinet level because we just don't have a lot of really in the State Department. There have been no appointments beyond the secretary level. Not sure exactly. I don't think we have a deputy secretary of defense queued up yet. But so I'm gonna slightly violate the premise of your question just by saying that I think that this is an issue that that the Secretary of Defense is very interested in. He's had long experience from his CENTCOM days in dealing with various challenges, and he's also worked obviously extensively, not just within the uniformed military, but also with other elements in the Department of Defense and the State Department bureaus that have dealt with these issues. So I think he's someone who understands this set of issues quite well. The indications seem to be that this is a matter of some concern to the Secretary of State as well. And as to what the interior structure of the National Security Council is going to be, I think it's only very slowly coming into shape, and that we really just don't know what the answers to that are. On Congress, I'm not going to name names, but we have certainly we understand that. This is an issue in which there is latent congressional interest, I would say, and which is to say that members are interested, but they're not organized, especially. And one of the things that I think is very important for us to do as we kind of take this message forward, and for others to do, especially the NGOs that are interested in this subject, is really to start gathering that latency together and turning it into a potent political force. I would say, just to add a few things, we have an annual human rights reporting that the government does. That's a congressional requirement. We have an ambassador at large for dealing with trafficking issues, and we do trafficking reports. That's a congressional intervention. Certainly, Congress has been interested in these kinds of issues, and when it gets interested, it can generate serious responses. So it's also I think it's especially important for those who are interested in this issue, frankly, to talk to Republicans about this issue. I think that Republican members of Congress may not like, especially in some instances, the particular Obama frame on the issue, but I think they're very interested in the issue as such. I mean, in the issue of preventing mass atrocities and keeping people alive. So it's reachable. We all need to reach to people where they are on this issue. It's not an issue that you can impose upon people. And if I think if there's a general level of concern, an awareness about human rights and the importance that poses, then that's where you start. That's what you build from.
Hi, Dan Sullivan with Refugees International. Just wondering about the recommendation on for U.S. leadership as opposed to being U.S. and European leadership on this, and then if the U.S. is not going to be a leader on this, then who is it among Europeans that is likely to or best equipped to take the lead?
Yeah, U.S. leadership is not meant in this instance to mean the same thing as the United States doing it on its own. In fact, just the opposite. The purpose of U.S. leadership here is to emphasize the point that this is not something that the United States can do on its own, and that the United States, in addressing this issue, and frankly, the Transatlantic community in addressing this issue, is where it's at because we wanted to focus on politically influential and militarily capable and economically strong countries that also share the same values. That is what we're trying to appeal to in addressing this issue. Not that the United States ought to be dictating how the effort ought to go, but that the United States ought to be stimulating others to do more in this area. Now, obviously, on the refugee question, there's an issue of the United States doing more and doing its fair share and living up to its responsibilities, and that's a big question as we speak. In Europe, obviously, there's been the Germans and the German Chancellor have played a really leading role, and I think the EU, at the EU level, has also played an extremely important role. A lot of EU members, however, have very, very different views about this, and in many cases are opposed to taking in any refugees at all. And again, we're in this circumstance in which the failure to address the issue and to cope with the issue adequately is undermining support for the issue in the first place. So the rise of populist parties, the rise of forces that choose to turn inward rather than to look outward and for collaboration in addressing these issues is undercutting the ability to deal with them in the first place.
I think I'll just add a word on that. There are important initiatives going on in capitals and at the EU in terms of addressing this issue from one perspective or another. And we should certainly encourage that and build on it. The other thing is we should also mention New York and the United Nations, where we are far more effective acting cooperatively, and where we have capable partners amongst our allies with very good missions at UN that are working these kinds of issues. So you can already see in certain instances leadership that is not just the United States or is not solely revolve around the United States. So that's I think another important avenue.
Hi, Sarah Mendelson. I was one of the USAID leads on APB, and more recently at the UN as U.S. Ambassador to the Economic and Social Council. Thank you for this report. This is all very pleasantly nostalgic, but I do, not the topic notwithstanding, but I do worry, as I think lots of people do, that leadership inside the U.S. government matters, but hopefully that there's enough muscle memory in the interagency that even if you aren't convening once a month, this is part of your regular job. But I wanted to push you a little bit on what's going on in other capitals and who else will lead, because I think all the questions you're asking and answering are exactly the right ones. And it's true, in New York, there are amazing partners among the like-minded. And I do think there's an opportunity to go up there and sit down with folks, maybe not live streamed, but just to discuss what are the opportunities, and specifically the Sustainable Development Goals, which sometimes people think of as UN goals, but they're not. They're owned by everybody. And they are beginning to affect how other countries do both domestic work, but also their bilateral assistance. And to get to the upstream issue, Goal 16 is perfectly built for this kind of work. But there hasn't been a kind of coming together of atrocity prevention folks, Goal 16 folks, a little bit, but it's still really early days. And so I would say there's opportunities there. This is one of the most interesting examples of work done outside government that then gets translated into government, partly because some of the people then came into government. But I agree with you, APBs don't need to pop up in capitals all over Europe. But it would be interesting to hear what more is going on in various capitals, where the energy is, and what kinds of sort of Swedish or German or British initiatives are underway. I mean, we have a richer sort of think tank community in the United States, but still, there's lots of universities and people who are interested in it. Final word, human rights up front in so many ways felt like APB. in its pluses and minuses. There was enormous resistance, though, among staff. And keeping an eye on that and trying to push that along, I think, is going to be an important thing. There's lots of leadership in terms of human rights, both with Zaid and Andrew Gilmore, but out in the field, there's a lot of resistance. So thank you.
Great. Well, that's thank you, Sarah. That's tremendous. In the first place, thank you for your work on this issue. I think it was, by all accounts, a challenge to get this thing set up, and well done. First thing I'll say is I know for a fact that if the Atrocity Prevention Board goes away, we'll want it back. And how I know this is because there was, at the tail end of the Clinton administration, convened by Ambassador David Sheffer, a proto-Atrocities Prevention Board. And the new administration coming in it wasn't formalized. There's no executive order, nothing like that. But it was an attempt to kind of begin this discussion in the interagency. This was not something that anyone was especially interested in pursuing in the George W. Bush administration, so it went away. And then a few years later, as we were thinking about this question on the Genocide Prevention Task Force, we had this bright idea. Maybe there should be a coordinated interagency process. And then we discovered that there had briefly been an attempt to coordinate an interagency process. So, it's a good idea. And the reason it's a good idea is because it can improve policy outcomes. That's why it's a good idea. So that's good. Now, on what some of our allies are doing, well, there's a unit in the UK that has got a new mapping framework for potential conflict issues and has some considerable, some serious resources to devote to prevention efforts coming out of that. There's in Berlin, there was of course, there was the white paper that was issued on the Bundeswehr by the government of Germany last summer, and that is now being followed up by the preparation of a civilian white paper that will address conflict prevention issues. I had an opportunity to write a little piece for the Süddeutsche Zeitung encouraging them to make a point of including atrocity prevention in those issues. The French have been leading the charge to try to think up ways in which we can, shall we say, if not get rid of the veto with regard to atrocity prevention issues, at least increase the political cost for exercising such a veto in circumstances where people are dying in large numbers. I think that's been a commendable initiative. Some of our smaller allies also, although not having the resources, have been, really at the forefront of this issue. One thinks of the Dutch in particular, and I don't want to leave anything out. I mean, Naomi's from there's great people working on this in Ottawa as well, and I'm happy to report that even at the NATO, NATO has recently expanded its concept of civilian protection from the protection of civilians against collateral damage during military operations to the protection of civilians who are coming under risk or assault. So I think that's an important step. So it's just a small sample. It's not completely current. I haven't been back in the field for all this, but there are things going on. This is an issue that I think governments are interested in, and international organizations as well.
Like he said, and it was really quite interesting when we had our meetings overseas to get a little peek into their own such as they exist interagency processes. We were particularly impressed with what we saw in the UK and Germany. I mean, the UK has through its intelligence community developed a process of not under the headline of atrocity prevention, but dealing with conflict issues to identify a series of conflicts of concern that were not receiving adequate policy level attention, and with the intention then of bringing to bear the kinds of resources that USAID in the United States can bring to bear behind this process. So it was a process of reviewing, identifying, and prioritizing certain conflicts that wouldn't otherwise have gotten the attention at the policy level, and then not only going through that analytical process, but then also backing it up with some development resources.
Yeah, one more thing, which is that we'd love to talk to you about the relationship of Sustainable Development Goals to this issue as well. You know, it's not something that we've really gotten into, but I think maybe others of you will have a thought of ways in which, you know, what you've been working on in particular might play into this, and you know, I think that's what we need to look at now.
I might just add just one or two things to that. I do think this is a moment where we have to think creatively about parallel agendas and agendas where there are clear benchmarks that we can move towards. I think one of the biggest challenges that has undermined the atrocity prevention field is the lack of those types of benchmarks. And there has been an effort, primarily driven by civil society, in partnership with governments, to try to think through what frameworks would look like for the kind of domestication or institutionalization of atrocity prevention at a domestic level, but it's very, very challenging to do. And where some of my concerns lie around the uncertainty when it comes to U.S. leadership is that, to a certain degree, what has compelled initiatives, be it in Ottawa or Copenhagen or in The Hague, on the normative side or even on the tools side, has been a request from the U.S., a push from the U.S. And that goes not just for things like the Peacekeeping Forum where commitments were made, but also just on the basics of let's have conversations about Five Eyes and intelligence sharing. Let's have conversations about what USAID programming could look like with DANITA in a particular country. And I worry because those efforts have been moving forward without the creation of a real civil society bedrock to rest on in many of the other countries. There's many people in this room right now that have been engaged on these issues for the past decade, coming from a civil society's perspective, working in think tanks, NGOs, faith-based groups. That doesn't exist in many of the countries that we partner with. And there is a nascent effort right now to try to develop parliamentary working groups, which I think is promising because I think, to Todd's point, many of the innovations and many of the things that stick are those that are requirements that have been enacted through parliaments or Congress that actually hold governments accountable and push for more transparency on what their policies are. And I think, you know, in the U.S. context, we are seeing increasing discussion about how to mandate training for foreign service officers, how to ensure that there's an annual threat assessment that incorporates atrocity prevention, how to get annual hearings of State Department officials and others on atrocity prevention. Having that echoed in London, in Berlin, and elsewhere, I think will create a force multiplier effect. But it has to be driven. And I'm worried that we haven't quite created the momentum right now outside of the government space to actually sustain that during this period of uncertainty, and also to help explain to the public in the respective countries why their governments should be focusing on fragility or conflict stabilization and earmarking funds to those more upstream efforts. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, and perhaps the SDGs is one of the more concrete ways of pushing that forward.
Elizabeth Wilson, the Land Host Human Rights Commission in the House of Representatives. And on the question of the legal basis, as I'm sure you know, one possible avenue to that is simply that enough states decide to intervene unilaterally, creating a customary norm. But what then, in your framework, prevents the abuse of atrocity prevention for other purposes and foreign policy objectives that may not be so savory? And then with respect to Syria particularly, what would have been your ideal scenario? What should have the response to Syria have looked like? And to what extent was it complicated by the escalation by Obama and the others to regime change that went technically beyond the UN resolution?
I'll start with the first one, which is you've put your finger on the issue, of course, with respect to finding opportunities to take advantage of new circumstances in which the use of force or other actions that could be authorized by the UN could be justified. I guess my response to this kind of thing is that Article 51 of the UN Charter is the article that is the exception to the use of force and individual or collective self-defense, and that seems to provide ample cover for those in global politics to take action that isn't valid under international law or otherwise. So I guess I worry less. It's a valid concern that you state, but I worry less about what new rationales might be provided for certain actors, because I believe that those actors will find those rationales as they see fit, and they've been doing it already. What I am concerned about is removing barriers to action, whatever that is. By the way, I'm not necessarily focusing on military action. It can be naming and shaming. The UN can do that very well and it can be very effective. So it can be diplomatic action. It can be economic action. It can be military action which doesn't involve shooting. There's a whole range of things that can be done. But if you're in a circumstance in which the only opportunity in which you can take such action is despite an exigent circumstance or despite repeated efforts to use UN channels, etc., is absolute agreement, you're in a problem area. I'm not suggesting bypassing, but I am suggesting a range of other things. One, Todd mentioned, which is putting pressure on the use of the veto in these circumstances. There's no magic to this, but it's a long political process and kind of building norms against engaging and willy-nilly using the veto, particularly when something as severe as mass atrocities are at stake. It's thinking about the kinds of activities that can take place with a UN umbrella, short of those that require UN Security Council action, and there are many like that. And it's about thinking about thinking about other solid legal bases on which action can be taken so that you're not upsetting the norms and the prohibition against the use of force that obtains under the UN Charter. And there are a variety of ways to do that as well. So there are no magic solutions to this, but there is clearly a need to engage in this kind of discussion, and there's now a record of many decades that I think point in some positive directions that won't solve the problem that you're talking about, but I think will be helpful in making it harder for those to say that the answer is either a Security Council vote or doing nothing, because that to me is a false choice.
So you left me with the question of how I would have solved Syria. Okay. Let's begin with the diagnosis of the problem at that particular moment. It has been, the UK conducted a study of attitudes within government in the early years of the Syria, in the early phases of the Syria crisis, and determined that most UK officials believed that the Assad regime would quickly fall. I believe that is also true of the U.S. government's anticipation of the course of events, and that therefore therefore doing nothing would be an acceptable path to a favorable result. The President of the United States having declared that Assad must go, along with several of our European allies. And so I think that there was, in this sense, there's nothing more familiar in foreign policy circles than the statement that hope is not a policy. But hope is often a policy. And it's the question of whether you feel like time is on your side or not. And that's always a calculation that you have to reality check against what you're hoping to come out. I think we had options in the early stages of the Syria crisis that, if we had taken them, might have yielded a better outcome. I think grounding Assad's air force, preventing his ability to drop bombs on his own people, might have been a helpful course. I think as well that there's some talk or some op-eds and proposing things like safe corridors for civilians to repair to in case of endangerment. So those were some, I think, a couple of things that would have clearly meant a greater degree of U.S. involvement, and I can certainly understand the hesitancy associated with that. But as I said, if the expectation is that things will get better one way or another, or that you can cheerfully allow a problem like Syria to run its course in the expectation that the problems generated locally will tend to remain local, has pretty much blown up. And we need to think very seriously about that. I don't think that inaction in the expectation of good outcomes is good policy.
I think on that somber note, we are going to have to end today's discussion. I want to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank the Stanley Foundation for partnering with us, the staff here at the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, who've been supporting the work that Todd and Lee have been doing, the Hoover Institution, those in the room who are working on atrocity prevention. Thank you for all of your efforts. And I think perhaps it's important just to kind of leave with the final note that it's critical that we continue to drive the efforts around atrocity prevention, but that we also seek to diversify those who are playing leadership roles and recognize that there are so many different facets to creating a response, especially when it comes to early action and early warning and detection of risks. We've talked a lot today about development, about military responses. There are aspects that, for example, the Germans and the Brits have been trying to slowly lead on around accountability. There are Scandinavian partners that have been leaders on mediation. I think what is crucial at this particular point with all of this uncertainty is, as Todd was saying, continue to find forums to bring governments together to have conversations about where the strengths exist, where capacities need to be strengthened, but also it seems most critically at this point, where the focus is so much on preventing refugee flows, on tackling terrorism, on the potential for risks of terrorism, that we really focus on trying to frame the conversation and go back to the basics of what you started the discussion with, explaining why preventing atrocities is a first-tier priority. And that's going to be something that requires bipartisan support here, but in each of the capitals that we're focusing on. And hopefully this report will help contribute to that. I urge you all to take it forward in this post-Libya world where we're now dealing with all the more challenges that exist. So thank you very much, everyone, for